pregunta para los panelistas, pueden agregar en la sección de preguntas.
If you have any questions or comments, you can use the question and answer function. And as usual, we'll have a recording available for you on our YouTube channel starting next week. You can find this link here in our chat. For those of you who are just joining us, our Cities Network is a platform for regional cooperation for the exchange of knowledge, solutions, and best practices among Latin American cities. And given the multi-sectorial nature of urban development, it's good to have dialogue among the various players from the public, private, academic sectors. This is for over 250 cities that are a part of this network. Also, we want to take advantage of all the knowledge and know-how we have within the bank. In this way, we seek to contribute to strengthening leadership in urban planning, capacity building for officials in the cities, and to build synergies among these cities. If you'd like to have more information or you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, our Cities Network newsletter, you can do it through the chat or you can write to us. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we have other webinars that we're working on for TOD. And I'd like to remind you that this is our second webinar of the series, and we have one more. On August 23rd, we talked about urban planning and mobility. We looked at the cases of Bordeaux and Guadalajara. We have that recording available for you now, and you can find it here as well. The third webinar will be next Wednesday, September 6th, and we'll be talking about new trends in mobility, looking forward to 2030. So if you're interested, we'd be happy to have you join us. And as part of the series for the rest of the year, we'll have the food security series. We started that in June, and we have the full climate action for Latin American and Caribbean cities series, and this will begin in September. If you'd like to participate, you can sign up to receive all this information. Now let's get started with today's session on transportation-oriented development, and we're looking at examples from various cities. TOD, as we call it, is the use of a land strategy that seeks to bring together urban components such as the use and occupation of land, the distribution of public spaces, and the promotion of economic activities, stimulating housing, commerce, and services being developed near the corridors and stations for our transit systems. Economic viability for a plan such as this one is closely linked to the scale of public investment necessary to make this a reality, as well as income sources that are able to support this. The main investment for the execution of a TOD plan is based on the building of infrastructures that include urban roadways, bike lanes, sidewalks, etc., and underground systems for service distribution. During today's session, we'll talk about various financing sources that are available for local administrations in order to finance these significant infrastructure investments, such as the ones we will talk about today. We have the traditional sources, also non-traditional and innovative financing sources, such as land value capture, and others. Will see very interesting things that are being done. And we'll talk about the experiences of Bogotá, Washington, D.C., and we'll see their innovations and how they are financing these projects. We also have with us Ignacio Montojo and Ana Claudia Rosbach, who will talk about their experience in financing for these projects in cities in Latin America and in the US. So we'll start this conversation as follows. First of all, we have the pleasure of having with us today Luis Schlueter, a sector specialist for the Housing and Urban Development Division at the bank. He'll be our moderator today. And we'll have for our cases, study cases, Bogotá and D.C. We have Simon Mesa Acosta, professional specializing in real estate development management and non-fair income for the Metro Company of Bogotá. He'll tell us about the case of Bogotá. We also have with us Liz Price, Vice President of Real Estate and Parking, and she'll tell us for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. She'll tell us about Washington, D.C. And as I mentioned, we also have Ignacio Montojo with us. He is the principal for HR&A Advisors, and Ana Claudia Rosbach, Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and she's an advisor in housing and urban planning policies for the organizations of the Global South. So it's a very interesting conversation for today. We had a very interesting one last week as well. Before we begin, I'd like to ask a question that I always ask at the beginning. What sector are you joining us from? If you would please scan for the Mentimeter and tell us, are you from the public sector, local or national level public sector, or private sector, civil society organizations, or some international organization? So if you would, please scan the Mentimeter so you can respond to that question. What sector are you a part of? This is very important information for us. It helps us design what we do in these webinars. So we appreciate your effort in participating. The panelists will also be able to have a better idea of who is listening and what they would like to emphasize. Thank you very much for participating, for voting on this question. And now I'll give the floor to Luis. But before that, I would ask you once again for Mentimeter to tell us in one or two words what you believe are the main challenges in financing TOD in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we have the Mentimeter. We are awaiting your response. One or two words. What is the main challenge in obtaining financing for these TOD projects? Policies, governance, sustainability, financing, economic viability. Some of them can be grouped together. Planning, governance. These appear to be key topics in this conversation. We'll see what our guests can tell us about this today. Thank you once again for being with us today. I'll give the floor to Luis right now. He will be our moderator. Thank you very much and welcome, Luis. Thank you very much, Maria Camila. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined us today. We have wonderful panelists today, so we're very excited about this session today. Last week, we heard the first webinar and we presented the concept of transportation-oriented development. Let's review very quickly what this is. TOD is an opportunity to offer different mobility options, improve connectivity, and make communities on these corridors more dynamic. And this also promotes a mixed use for urban spaces. It creates public spaces for social interactions and community well-being. It incentivizes high density real estate development to maximize the use of land. It promotes activities such as walking and bike riding. This also helps with traffic, and it integrates primary and secondary transit routes. And actually, subnational level governments in Latin America and the Caribbean spend 25% or devote 25% of this expenditures to this, but they need to bring together their financial capacity, which is often limited, with their extensive responsibility for social equity, fighting climate change, and transportation and others. So how can cities mobilize additional resources in order to finance TOD projects? That's the question. And actually, there is a promising situation here because TOD gives us an opportunity for innovation, which even allows cities to diversify their sources of income, to have better capability to carry out high impact TOD projects. And what's interesting here is that it generates two ways of obtaining income: through projects, through the development of real estate projects, retail space, advertising, etc. But TOD also generates additional income through the area of influence of the project. These are profit capture instruments or tools, for example. And regarding this second aspect, we should highlight that TOD solves immediate necessities of transit, etc., but also has a potential to generate important or significant socioeconomic benefits in increasing the value of properties and land around this area, and this creates additional tax revenue for these areas. So it doesn't just help with specific needs for transit, but also it's a source of economic growth and development. Public investment means benefits for the community, real estate gains in value, we get more tax revenue, and then this can be reinvested in more projects. And we need to highlight that very often through these types of projects, the benefits are long-term projects that we see when the project comes to its conclusion. And this increase in value can happen starting when the project is announced and continue to the point when the project is actually being managed. So in this regard, cities need to have broad financial tools that allow them to face initial costs for a TOD project and also ensure their operation in the long term. Here we see a number of financial instruments that are available for many cities in the world. Some generate a single instance of income, others recurring income, such as the tax improvement. Let's talk about the specific cases that we will study today with our panelists. And for that, I'll give the floor to our first panelist, our first presenter, Simon Mesa. He works for the Bogotá Metro. He'll tell us what innovations they are working on for TOD project financing in that company. Go ahead, please. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'll share my screen at this point. Luis, could you confirm that you can see my screen? You should be able to see my screen right now. Is that the case? Yes, we can see it. Great, thank you. Greetings to all. I'm Simon Mesa. I am an economist. I work for the Metro de Bogotá company. It's been about 5 years now, and I work in the urban planning and management sector. I'll tell you what we've been doing in the last few years. I'll touch upon four topics that I think are the most relevant ones for today's webinar. First, I want to talk about how important the metro, the subway is, the construction of the first line, which is what we're doing on now, and how important its later development will be. And another key aspect, the institutional context. The metro company is talking about urban development, and this is relatively innovative since our land use plan is a tool for everyone. So this is interesting. And I want to tell you also about our mandate. And finally, just a teaser about what we do in our observatory on land use and occupation. So this is Bogota, about 10 million inhabitants, and it has sprawled into other municipalities. It's very dense, however, very compact. And what you see here is the first line of the metro that's in red. It's a solution that we've been trying to install for half a century. We have now a company called Transmilenio, which was a commuter train, but now this first line of the subway has become necessary in the city. So it is under construction now. It's going to have 16 stations. It goes from the southwest of the city, one of the densest parts of not just Colombia, but of the world. And it goes to the center north part of the city. What you see in red, this means a 10-minute walk, and the lighter red is 20 minutes walk. The second line of the metro is being is under study right now and under pre-qualification. We've chosen the concession holder that will develop it. The first line is elevated. The second one is underground. It will have 11 stations and will provide solutions for the rest of the city. And as you can see, these will be fed through from two key corridors from Street 68 and from the city of Cali. We have the roads that come into and feed into these metro lines. The lines in gray are ones that are projected within our new land use plan. Of course, feasibility studies are still pending, but this is being projected for the future. The metro system, as you can see, will have a huge impact on the city, not just in terms of people's commuting and their transit and accessibility benefits, but also in urban development in terms of the value, the occupation of the land, the use of the land. So taking into account this initial context, we should know as well that in Bogota, the operator, the initial operator for urban renewal was under the habitat sector. It's the Renovo company, and they were focused more on habitat and providing housing solutions in Bogota. But to the extent, or as the Bogota company was created in 2016, part of its mandate, yes, continue to be developing the metro and its various lines, but then it has another aspect of its mandate, which has to do with urban renewal projects that go together with the development of infrastructure. So this begins to really shape up in an interesting way because renewal now will also be oriented towards transportation. So those TOD principles will be very relevant. And as you can see, the metro company has its organizational structure, and within it, you see the Office for Urban Renewal and Non-Fair Income, nor non-fair revenue. In the institutional framework of the city, it's interesting to see that land use plans are governed by, and the regulation of that plan is within the planning section. So there has to be a lot of dialogue among the various sectors in order to make sure that there's a greater attention being paid to renewal. Now, going into the mandate of the Office for Urban Development, the company, we have to say, was created recently in 2016, and also the Urban Development Office was created in 2021. So these strategic columns are being created now, and these actions will take place in the short, medium, and in some cases in the long term. So it's a whole strategy associated with what we call the area of influence, and this has to do with what Luis was referring to, those areas, those spaces that land use planning allow us to have and to modify. Another strategic pillar is related to the infrastructure, the public infrastructure related to the metro. So this means that there will be businesses within that transportation infrastructure in the medium term. The first line will start operating in 2028, but also in the pre-operational stage, we want to have some economic leveraging of that area. And then there is the other aspect, other non-fair related businesses. We have a whole portfolio right now. It's just a draft for now, but we divided it into 5 areas: urban, real estate, financing, sustainable transit, and data and technology. The areas of influence are those around the stations that provide special conditions for private developers who can work with those areas that are near the stations. I'm showing you here in red the areas. This is just an indication for now. What happens within these areas of influence? You can see it in layers, but the purpose is, the goal is, as the private developer is working in these areas, they can have a link to the public aspect. If they develop certain things, they can access certain benefits. If they do an urban renewal project, the urban renewal projects for sustainable mobility, that's how we are calling it, then they can have access to even better terms and conditions. Now, if it's an urban renewal project in association with the public sector, they can have access to even more beneficial conditions. So this is very important because the private developer can associate or work with the public sector to have this development, and better conditions are created for capturing value. The second point that I was telling you about is related to what's going to happen inside the infrastructure. In this case, we're talking about retail spaces within the station access buildings. The first line is elevated and the stations are on either side of the line. Most stations have this design. So we could agree with the concessionaire for the construction of a certain area for retail, and also advertising will be available within the stations as well as in the trains. And that revenue will be distributed 60-40. That's the current term, 60 for the metro company, 40 for the concession holder. I was also telling you about, in terms of real estate development, on those sites that have been purchased, and now there's a certain condition that they're in. Some are remnants. There's some space that remains after that, and there can be more real estate development adjacent to the station, and this offers more opportunities, sustainable mobility, for example. In this case, in this design, this preliminary design, we have 2,000 square meters for equipment and 50,000 square meters for GLA, if I'm not mistaken. There's a legal instrument that's needed for that. It's a right in rem for that is necessary for this urban development to take place within the lands of the infrastructure. And this means in the stations and these adjacent buildings, the idea here is that these will be trigger projects, so to speak. That means that people will have access, much quicker access to services. Many people talk about the 15-minute city. Here we're talking about the 30-minute city. 1.3 million square meters, new square meters will be generated, and also new bike lanes, 19 kilometers, and bike lanes are big in Colombia, as you know, and we'll be linking these metro stations to the Transmilenio existing portals, and as much as possible, we'll have a mixed use to supply what we were saying right now, to provide for the various businesses there. And even now we're implementing this plan to take advantage of these spaces as the construction project is underway. We'll have income for the metro as well as for the city based on visual external advertising, where there's an enclosure of the construction area, and this will help us in financing the pre-operational stage of the construction of the first line. And as I was saying earlier, we have a whole business portfolio, and we're looking into it now. It's not finalized, and I won't go into detail, but I wanted to compliment Luis' presentation, saying that for the metro company, the focus on real estate related to the TOD is very important, but there are many other possible strategies for urban financing that the Metro Bogotá company can implement. We have 5 business areas, as I mentioned. We're looking at the viability of each one of these potential businesses and how they can be implemented in the short, medium, and long term, and we'll be developing that agenda as we work on the first and second lines of the metro. And finally, I wanted to just give you an initial taste of this. This will be very important for us, our observatory on the use and value of land. And this was created last year to monitor the effects of the construction of the first line and subsequent lines on the value and use of the land, since we know that impacts will be generated that can be positive or negative on the population. And this year, we've made some significant progress. We have some of the structure already there, but with the University of the Andes, the World Bank, the IDB, we have done some preliminary studies to try to understand beforehand what impacts we will have.
So that's basically what I had to show. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon. That was really very interesting to see the different business models to enhance income. So now it is my privilege to move on to the second presentation with Liz Price, the Vice President for Real Estate and Development at the Washington Metro Area Transit Authority. Liz, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. You can just let me know if this is visible because I can't see you all now.
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Liz Price. I'm Vice President of Real Estate and Development at the Washington Metro Area Transit Authority here in Washington, D.C. I'll just start with a little bit of context for Metro. We call our system and our organization Metro for short. We are the transit system that serves the nation's capital, which covers 2 states as well as the District of Columbia, which is an independent city-state for lack of a better term. It includes many counties as well as certainly very much interest and engagement from the federal government. So it's a very complex political environment that we deal with. It's also one of the most mature transit systems in the United States. It was opened in the 1970s, and we today have 98 stations that crisscross around the region. It's a mix of typical subway, underground, light rail, as well as heavy rail, commuter rail. So it's really kind of a hybrid system. So taking people underground through the urban core and then through longer distances out to the far reaches of the region. The region has about 6 million population, and so this system has been critical to the growth of the region over the last 40 years. What you see on the screen here is just a snapshot of our funding and our budget. Like many transit authorities, we are challenged in the post-COVID environment with reduced ridership, which has affected our fare revenue for sure. And we're facing some significant budget gaps and deficits projected for the FY25 budget cycle. We had a very large federal investment during COVID, as did all cities and transit authorities to support ongoing transit operations, but that basically runs out in this fiscal year. And so we're looking at some pretty serious challenges coming in the next year. And then so we've got a $2.4 billion operating budget, as well as a $2 billion capital budget, which is funded, as I mentioned, by our jurisdictional partners, the state of Maryland, Virginia, District of Columbia, and the U.S. government. I run the Office of Real Estate and Development. Metro is unique in that we own quite a lot of property throughout the region. Much of that was acquired when the system was initially built back in the 70s with support and investment from the federal government. So there are federal ties and rules to the way we engage with transit-oriented development as a result. As I mentioned, the system has grown over time. We just opened an extension of the line last fall, and so we're at 98 stations. We accommodated about 1 million commuters a day pre-COVID. We're about 50% back on rail, and we're close to 80 to 90% back on bus post-COVID. So my office manages many things, but I think what we'll talk most about today is joint development. That is the term that we use, and it's a federal government term because of the federal engagement with our real estate, which basically means private development on transit-owned property, and it involves the construction of public transit facilities with that private development. So these are complex public-private projects, and that's what my office, one of the things my office manages as a result. So Metro has been a national leader in joint development. Since the system opened in the 70s, we've completed, with our private partners, of course, 55 buildings at 30 stations. You can see here on the right sort of a faded out view of our system, which has, you can see multiple lines going throughout the region. I won't focus too much on the operational side today, but you can see here highlighted, where our stations have been. So we've really been throughout much of the region, but centered on the urban core in the middle, as well as north and west of the city. We've built 17 million square feet of mixed-use development at and around our stations. It's important to note that we are tax exempt as a public transit authority. So our land is untaxed until we bring in partners through joint development. As a result, we are generating almost $200 million in annual local and state taxes on the projects that we've built to date. These projects also generate important revenues for Metro. First and foremost, it creates ridership, generates more ridership as we bring housing, offices, and services closer to our stations. Pre-COVID, the estimate was about 5 million annual new trips created by these projects, which generates significant new fare revenue and annual lease revenue and sales revenue. So last year, we took a step back and we looked at our program and released a strategic plan for joint development, which really looked at what have we done, where have we come from, and where, what else is still available, and how can we accelerate development at our stations. So it looked to align our interests with our local government partners, looked at ways to attract more investment to our stations. We looked at how to prioritize our future station opportunities. And so we really looked at three things. What were the infrastructure needs for those stations? What was the development potential of the land that we controlled? And what was the market readiness of those stations? And so using sort of those three criteria, we prioritized and evaluated where we should focus over the next 10 years. With the ultimate goal of accelerating joint development, with the goal of executing 20 new agreements in the next 10 years. So this slide highlights sort of a summary of what we have remaining in the portfolio and what we're trying to achieve. The green dots are where we have stations with land available for development. We think they could support about 31 million square feet of mixed-use development. A lot of that we think would be housing because of where they're located, as you can see, primarily outside of the urban core, in further out into neighborhoods and into the suburbs. Upon completion, we estimate that these sites would generate and add to the tax base another $340 million a year in local and state taxes, as well as significant new ridership and revenue for Metro. So in terms of TOD funding, we kind of, as part of this process with our strategic plan, we looked at sort of how we have approached these projects in the past and what has worked, as well as, what are the challenges ahead and what are we going to need to do differently to be able to advance projects. Historically, many of our projects were smaller infill parcels, as I mentioned, a lot of them in the urban core. They had lower transit replacement needs, so we weren't having to move parking or build garages because of the locations of a lot of these stations and sites. Also limited needs for other type of site infrastructure, oftentimes stronger real estate markets that had higher land values, higher rents. And generally the land value, our land value, exceeded the cost that we might need to absorb to build transit facilities or to build infrastructure. And so we could generally advance projects by discounting our land value, incentivizing a developer to build what we need to have built for transit purposes, and could advance projects together in that manner. And that was the typical approach. That was sort of the formula that we used. The example on the screen is an example in Fort Totten, which is a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. In a large site, but an infill site that was essentially vacant land. This had been construction staging area when the system was built. And so it had no active transit uses or facilities that needed to be replaced. And so we could dispose of it, and any infrastructure, new roads, new sidewalks could be accommodated through the land value itself. As we look ahead, our projects are more challenging and have larger financial gaps that we need to address, in part because they are larger and more complex properties themselves, oftentimes 5 to 50 acres. As a result, more infrastructure is needed, either streets and utilities, which don't exist, or in many cases, changes to our transit facilities. So oftentimes we're talking about suburban locations with large surface parking lots. So we have to first build a garage to handle some of the parking needs that we have in order to make space for other productive uses. And so that could be quite costly. There's also certainly, and I'm sure in many of your cities, an increasing desire for more affordable housing throughout the region, but particularly at transit accessible locations. And so that creates a need for more support and funding to make that feasible. And we're also looking at sites that are in softer real estate markets further out in the suburbs that may not be able to justify the rents that could support all of these additional costs. The net result is the land value we project in many cases is less than the cost that we need to cover in order to advance the project, which means we really have to work closely with our state, local, and federal partners to identify other sources of funding and subsidy to advance these projects. One example on the right here is Capitol Heights. Great example. The site is not particularly large, but it is a large surface parking lot, which we're planning to close. So we're actually trying to manage our costs by not actually rebuilding the parking, but it does have some significant costs to reroute and rebuild the bus loop, and some other pretty large infrastructure issues related to stormwater and utilities, which have a several $million cost. And then we think there's a market gap that there's going to need to be some subsidy in place in order to incentivize the market to build the housing that we want to see here. And so we're in active discussions with the Prince George's County to identify both infrastructure money, but also affordable housing funding to help advance this project. This is sort of a snapshot of maybe that same discussion. We have about 7 sites that we're trying to advance over the next year, which we estimate will generate about $800 million in new state and local taxes over 30 years. But they all require some level of local investment, either for transit and site infrastructure, like we mentioned, or for incentivizing increased density on the site, or addressing affordability. One reason why we're looking at density is that we understand both for Metro and also the region, it's really important to try to maximize density at transit. There are no taxes generated by our sites today, and if we go with mid-rise projects, lower density projects, we're getting about 1/3 of what we think the total tax benefits could be if we max out the density on some of these sites. And so there's a real opportunity cost for not incentivizing higher density projects. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. We can come back to that one if there's time later. So one area that has been particularly a focus in this region is affordable housing. WMATA does not have its own affordable housing policy. As I mentioned, we're active in basically 3 states and multiple counties, all of which have their own affordable housing requirements. And so, as a landowner across the region, our policy has been to abide by the local jurisdiction requirements. And the way we achieve that is we oftentimes give a discount to land in order to achieve the minimum, which is usually 10% or 15% of units affordable. But we have worked, collaboratively with jurisdictions to identify ways to improve affordability, with their support. But it really has to be in partnership with the local jurisdictions. Here on the screen is an example in D.C. Where we discounted the land value to pay for a new garage, which was needed to enable this project. And then the D.C. government came in with a payment in lieu of taxes, which is similar to a tax abatement in order to fund deeper levels of affordability. Most recently, we've put in place two additional tools to support affordable housing at Metro. The first in a county here in Maryland, they were looking at the issue of density at Metro stations. And the issue was the county had zoned our land for high density, but the rents were not sufficient to support high-rise construction. And so essentially, developers who had rights to our land were going to advance without building the maximum because it didn't pencil, it didn't make sense financially. And so the county put in place a 15-year tax abatement. If the developer went with high-rise versus mid-rise, they would be eligible for this tax abatement, which increased the total units on the site, of course, also increases the number of affordable units as a percentage. And now that is a policy and a tool that we can use throughout that county, which is showing great results. And then finally, Amazon recently moved one of its major headquarters to this area, and they invested $125 million in our joint development projects to create more affordable housing. So they came in as a separate funder to help deepen affordability levels in a way that Metro could never do. So finally, just in wrapping up, and as we look ahead for how to advance these complicated TOD projects, there's certain things that we think Metro as a transit authority, things we can do, but there's certainly things that we need a lot of support from our local partners. On our side, we need to look at ways to reduce the footprint of our transit facilities on our real estate to be as efficient as possible, to create opportunities for other uses to come closer to the station, to apply commercial design standards so that we're building things as cost effectively as possible. Reinvesting or deferring land value to address investment needs to the extent that we can. And then getting board approval for any Metro requirements as early as possible, so we give as much certainty to the market about what to expect. From the jurisdictional side, we need to coordinate closely with state and local funding, pursuing federal assistance. We didn't talk about that much yet, but there's a lot in the US, a lot of grants available for transit as well as other TOD infrastructure and investments, as well as affordable housing and economic development programs. And finally, encouraging local jurisdictions to include entitlements and zoning that permit the greatest density at transit, and also reduce requirements like parking that add additional costs to some of these projects that make them infeasible. So with that, I will conclude.
Thank you, Liz. That was a great presentation as well. Very interesting to see how strategy for WMTA to develop land around the station is evolving, especially around now in the context of the post-COVID world. Ahora vamos a pasar a la siguiente parte de
We will
la.
now move on to the next part of our session, and we're going to have a discussion with Ignacio Montoto and Ana Claudia Rosbach, and we'll be taking some questions prepared on the financing and funding opportunities to advance things in this field. Ignacio, I hope you can hear us. Ignacio, Ana Claudia. We've just heard about some of the opportunities identified in Bogotá and Washington in terms of funding sources, finance, as existing at the city level to finance TOD infrastructure. Ignacio, based on your experience and what you've done, could you sum up what you would say are those various sources of fund mobilization across the different stages? What about the difference between funding, financing, and the delivery when it comes to these projects? Could you help us elucidate the difference between these and how these things fit in with each other? Thanks, Luis. That's a very good question. First, you need to identify capital requirements for a project over the whole life cycle, which of course includes the planning and pre-development stage, as well as the project construction and execution phase, which is usually highly capital intensive, in addition to maintenance during the project's life cycle, which may be up to 50 years. The present value of operation and maintenance should not be ignored, because that can be substantial. So that would be the first recommendation or point for context. And then what you said, Luis, is actually right. There is sometimes a bit of a confusion between financing and funding. In other words, funding, finance, and delivery should be treated as different things. Today, we are mainly focusing on the first two, so revenue, funding, and finance. funding is about payments or contributions by entities to projects, whereas financing refers to securing the capital resources for the acquisition or payment in connection with a project. Often the income, the funding is used as a repayment source for financing, which is often by way of debt or equity involving the private sector. And another important thing to clarify here is that normally the different income sources, which we will talk about a bit more, exhibit a profile in terms of the scale of the income that can be generated by each of the sources. There's the time factor, if these are one-time source of income or if they last over time. And there's the volatility factor. How feasible is it to predict the sources, both for the medium and longer term? Based on the three factors, the scale, the time, and volatility, you must find the most appropriate use for the sources of income or funding, repayment of finance, debt, principal, or direct support for the operation and maintenance of the TOD projects. So then, income and funding on the one hand, financing on the other, and separately there's delivery. For example, PPPs are a delivery model. Sometimes that involves financing. I don't know if that addresses your first question, Luis. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much, Ignacio. My second question is a bit more specific on financing alternatives. What instruments cities can use to advance and fund the projects? Of course, there's vast experience financing clients in the LAC region. I was wondering if we could ask you to tell us a bit about the opportunities that exist in terms of financing alternatives, and perhaps you can tell us about some specific experience of your work and what led to the success of the projects. Yes, if you will allow me, Luis, I will use a slide here to answer the question. As I was saying, it is important to distinguish between source of income, financing sources, and delivery models. If you look at the revenue or income sources, again, the webinar where deals mainly with the first two, at the project or district level, and you mentioned this, Luis, in your intro, there are value capture instruments. This is a wide range of options. Many countries in the region can access a vast toolkit when it comes to value capture instruments. Then there's the monetization of public real estate, and sometimes the value of land is not enough to fully fund the sort of work that is needed to refurbish the place, or to have the station put in place. But the idea is that there must be a positive net value, and you can monetize through direct sale of the land. There's the issue of the fares and rates applicable to transit. There's also the business concessions, could be more or less permanent facilities.
Pero un abanico de ingresos que tiene más que
There's
ver
a range of income sources, and sometimes you may look at energy related or digital concessions or leases.
picas internet.
We seem to have intermittently lost the audio. And then there's public financing and multilateral and bank and private financing. We could also have transport agencies. Sorry, Ignacio, can you hear us? We seem to have some connectivity issues. Yeah, I think my connection dropped. Yes, the last 2 minutes perhaps were a little bit choppy. Sorry about that. I'll just turn off my video and perhaps leave you to it. I don't know, Luis, if you'd like to ask anything else. No worries, Ignacio. Thanks very much. And making the most of the remaining time, I would now like to hand it over to Ana Claudia. Municipalities and cities in the LSA region face major challenges when it comes to subnational finance. What would you say are innovative national or subnational finance mechanisms in the field of transit? Anything you could share with us? Thanks, Luis. Well, first, I think it is important to know that we are talking about transit-oriented development. This includes a whole range of investments across different areas. Let me say, the presentations were great. They were really fantastic. Very good options, both Bogotá and Washington. And then there's the issue of the tax structure differences between our region and the states. Up to 75% of revenue in the states is generated locally, whereas on average in Latin America, I would say it's the other way around. So for us in Latin America, there is a major reliance on the national or federal level resources. Liz talked about the grants, for instance, but you know, also there are finance sources through development banking, whether domestic or international. And in most cases, the financing goes through the national treasury, through the national government. And in some cases, it goes to the municipal level. So that's one thing to highlight, the tax structure. This requires some degree of coordination. It's good that you talked about governance in the Mentimeter, because that's very important. You need to integrate sectors and the land, the metropolitan territory. For example, as Liz said, in the case of Washington, D.C., you include several municipalities within a state. So such mechanisms are not structured in Latin America. The financing sources of development banking are national, international, and there's the public grants or donors on a sectoral basis, highly specific for the territories of certain municipalities. So that's one challenge that I just wanted to showcase. And this also offers an opportunity because, you know, I was looking at a recent study. It's from last year. It's the IMF. And I was looking at the way the tax structure in Latin America is examined there and the potential.
We are underusing the potential of financing from this source in Latin America. On average, for example, it's 0.7% of the GDP of Latin America comes from these taxes. So if we add this potential, in addition to other tools, and Ignacio told you about others, improvements, right transfers, those joint development projects as well, then with all of those, you could really improve the local capacity to add that source from the national side. At least in the long term, we'd be able to increase the influence of the more local areas in decision making by leveraging that. In Latin America, we finance mass transportation projects with these methods, the Metro of Quito, Curitiba, the BRT, with the sale of additional rights. That's how it was done. In the case of São Paulo, my city, in Brazil, there's a constitution and a legal framework that recognizes certain rights related to land, and this is very important. And São Paulo was able to increase financing sources for transportation, housing, public infrastructure. 30% goes to transportation, however, based on a potential supply or offer of these rights based on densification and vertical construction. And this is in the master plan, which was approved in 2014 and is under review. But it is establishing conditions. You can build to the size of your lot, but if you're going to build upwards, the air rights are a public good. The soil, the land is of private property. So this right of the air rights for construction is charged, and that payment goes to a fund, and 30% has to go to transportation. This, together with other profit capture instruments between 95 and 2017, about $4 billion were captured in these ways for the municipality, and this is significant. I also like to mention quickly the case of Colombia. We are working with the Colombians, but I understand that the law for the National Land Development Plan offers financial incentives for co-investment projects in mass transit for municipalities. And so the idea is for the national government to provide even more through a number of incentives for municipalities that are willing to leverage their own taxes and other instruments. So incentives from the national government for co-financing of these mass transit projects. I understand that there are about 13 rather municipalities in Colombia today that are going through this process. Thank you very much, Ana Claudia. Ignacio, is there anything you'd like to add regarding this question? Yes, I'm sorry once again that I lost my connection. And regarding what Ana Claudia was saying, I'd like to add that there are other innovative revenue sources. Wamara, for example, where Liz works, they've implemented that or WMATA, they've installed optic fiber in the tunnels for rental or for monetization in some way through internet and telephone service providers. So that's an initiative that I think has also been used in the New York subway. And with our plans in Latin America to expand our digital infrastructure, I think this would be an interesting idea to explore. Also, WMATA is looking into the installation of electric vehicle chargers in their parking lots, and this benefits commuters, of course, and can also generate income. I think WMATA is looking for potential developers, operators, etc., to install these chargers for electric vehicles on their parking lot. So relatively innovative ideas that we have been seeing. Thank you very much, Ignacio. I have a couple of additional questions, but I'd like to also ask our audience, if you have any questions for our guests or our panelists, please type them into the Q&A. Another very important issue about tools that can be implemented and experiences in the region is the following. I think there's something that is indispensable, which is to understand what are the factors for success, those prerequisites that need to be present for municipal governments to be able to effectively implement some of these strategies that have different levels of complexity. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you. What do you feel are some of those prerequisites that local governments need to have in order to make some progress along this path? Yes, of course. I was preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about two main groups of challenges that can lead to opportunities, however, and that are based on basic structures and conditions that we need to have in our municipalities in Latin America. One main challenge, I would say, is related to the integration of the sources of financing, as we said earlier. I thought it was very interesting that there are similar models in housing or similar problems in housing in Bogota and in Washington, D.C. And the models that are being used are acknowledged and recognized. So it's not a surprise that they're using similar models. So we need to think about this ahead of time. What are some of these policies that we need to have established? And in terms of the land, how can we coordinate the use of land for the needs that we will have in our cities, considering housing and the role that this plays in the implementation of transit systems and the metropolitan scale, and in terms of the land scale, looking at the various sectors and sources or needs for investment that we have. Liz mentioned this. In many projects, there's a need, the value of the land is not enough. In fact, when you look at Latin America, the gaps are even greater because in Latin America, comparatively to the US, those income gaps in the population are even bigger. And we have structural problems, precarious settlements, structural deficiencies, and we need to overcome all of this. So that's another challenge that's coming in terms of how to coordinate all these elements. So first of all, you need to be quite clear on this need for coordination at the local level in terms of land sectors and at the metropolitan level as well. So these are the foundations, so to speak, that we're still building in Latin America so we can have a more holistic perspective. And we need models for metropolitan governance that are formal or informal, vertical, horizontal efforts. All these processes need to take place. We're doing it gradually, but we're doing it. So that is a very important precondition in order to have these DOT models in a way that is efficient and that has a positive impact. And regarding housing, there's a dichotomy because we have the valuing of the land to finance infrastructure, but as the land becomes more valuable, housing becomes more expensive, so it's easier or harder to implement social housing. So I was looking at some work from my colleague, someone from the Lincoln Center, looking at the case of Latin America in various countries. And housing continues to be a big problem because of this dichotomy. So we invest in infrastructure, but when it comes to housing, there's a problem. Liz mentioned local requirements as well. In the case of Washington, in our case in Latin America, we have urban planning that can help. In Colombia, there are requirements for social housing. In Brazil, we have something similar. So having a land use plan, having a master plan that establishes these zones and these requirements is fundamental if you want to have an effective TOD. Otherwise, we'll bump up against this issue with the housing. So this point focusing on housing. Then we want to talk about legal frameworks, having this technical and institutional capital already established. There's an asymmetry of information in Latin America. We don't have good information about the patterns of the real estate market and thus potential for profit capture based on its development. Sometimes we don't even have coordinated information regarding public investment. The national government makes decisions and the municipality doesn't know about something that could generate land use increase in value. So all this could be useful to have more organized, coordinated information. That institutional capital is also essential to make it feasible to have transparent processes and mechanisms of communication that are effective in order to communicate with society. You cannot leverage land management strategies and new taxes, etc., if society does not believe that this is legitimate. And that's why we need to bring our population, our society, and bring it and have it involved, because it's society that will pay for it in the end in some way, and they will also benefit from it. And also, we need to have an atmosphere of confidence for businesses to flourish there. So that's how we can have private involvement and have them fulfill that financing to complement financing from the government, from development banking, and from the revaluing of the land. That's important. But in order to have that, we need to have very clear foundations for governance and for that decision-making process. Decisions need to be communicated. There needs to be transparency and dialogue. Everyone mentioned that having a plan and a way to communicate it is fundamental also for facilitating the land management, whether it's for the development of the mechanisms itself or to coordinate with other sectors within the metropolitan scale. Thank you very much, Ana Claudia and Ignacio. We'll go now to some questions that we've received from our viewers. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all of them, so we've selected a couple. Maybe Ignacio, you can go back to your presentation because we're being asked to explain more about these profit capture tools or strategies and how this is related to TOD strategies. Yes, I'm actually afraid to project the presentation again because I might get disconnected again, but I can tell you about a range of some of these tools that exist. And there are some that generate revenue once, contribution due to improvements, or those impact or development fees as they know them in the US, or rights for construction and development, bonds for density that allow for additionally dense building in exchange for affordable housing or public spaces in private developments. There's another strategy, which is the requirement to build or to require public infrastructure or some kind of amenity in exchange for building permits for private developers. All of these are linked to permits or licenses and generate one-time revenue.
And then there are instruments that offer revenue over a more extended period, such as tax income financing in Colombia. We also have revenue through increased real estate tax. There's the tax on the land value. There's special assessment districts, and there are also economic revitalization areas, business improvement districts. That would be the range of instruments And of course, you can consider the ability to generate income, and there are instruments that are more complex to implement. Ana Claudia, in some cases, talked about the lack of data or the lack of an organized cadastre, which is all important when it comes to trying to look at value capture instruments dependent on the real estate tax. So depending on the ability to generate revenue, the complexity level when it comes to implementation, and the time for which the instruments can generate revenue, you end up choosing certain instruments rather than others. And of course, different instruments may be good and conducive to supporting the repayment of financing for capital investment, or in order to support the operation and maintenance of public projects. Thank you very much, Ignacio. Simon, we also have a question for you. The different business models identified for Metro are a subject of great interest, and especially the models related to technology as a financing alternative are interesting to mention. A few words on that? Yes, absolutely. You know, basically, the number of passengers, passenger flow is a possible source of information. And here it is about not just understanding how many people travel, but who they are in terms of what their preferences are, so as to understand and segment the profiles so as to make use of the information and sell it. And that way we can understand who is interested, because the territorial impact of the stations, according to where people board and get off, that will have an influence when it comes to making decisions on how much will be spent. So, you know, technology, art, and there's the connectivity issues. You know, the additional data and business is very much linked to advertising and other issues. There has been talk about other business options and technologies. In fact, we are doing consultancy work over the course of the year to see what can be viable. We are talking about intelligent lockers. This is a message service on your way into and out of the metro stations. But anyway, that's one of the things that we have found particularly interesting and innovative. Thank you, Simon.
Now a question from Liz. Liz, still with us? Liz, ¿nos escuchas? Yes.
Liz, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Perfect. So there's a question around affordable housing around stations, the MTA. This seems to be a common theme across the discussion we're having today. How does WMTA coordinate with local authorities, with state governments to encourage affordable housing near and around WMTA stations? What's your approach? What's the strategy? What has worked so far? And how is this part of your 10-year plan?
Yeah, as I mentioned previously, we don't have our own policy. We don't have a separate requirement that's WMATA's or Metro's. We seek to achieve the local jurisdiction's requirements. And so traditionally that's meant inclusionary zoning, if that's a familiar term in Latin America, which in our country is typically 10 to 15% of units required to be affordable. The rest can be market rate. As a public entity, we subsidize that by reducing our land value, because there's generally very little land value attached to affordable units. So essentially that's our contribution. And as I mentioned, in previous projects, the land value was sufficient to allow these projects to move forward without usually additional subsidies. As we progress and as the housing crisis, deepens and affordability needs are exacerbated. There's more and more focus on increasing beyond. I'm going to plug in for 1 second. I'm sorry, my computer's about to die, but I hope I don't lose audio when I switch over. So just give me 1 second.
No problem.
Can you still hear me?
We can. Sorry, we lost you actually there. We can't hear you, Liz.
It's always been a need, but the
You're back. Sorry, there is a delay on my end.
no.
I can hear you now.
Okay, I was like, that's what I was afraid of. Okay.
Sorry, Liz, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thanks.
Okay, I'll be very quick. We work very closely with our jurisdictional partners to identify what their goals are, because we can't achieve greater affordability without their investment or commitment. And so it's really a partnership. We have land in the right locations, but we don't have funds. We've got to put all of our money into transit, and we have a challenge there. And so we work with them to identify the tools that they have, whether it's affordable housing funding, grants, tax credits is a vehicle that we use in this country. But oftentimes it's a tax abatement, because as I mentioned, our land is tax exempt. And so they're getting nothing from our land today. So to invest future taxes, which they have no chance of getting until they develop the land, is a pretty powerful, proposal. And so that can oftentimes be a very important tool to help advance these projects. And then I mentioned the Amazon funding, which has helped deepen affordability in our projects. I will just follow up on what Ana Claudia said. I mean, as these sites get developed, rents tend to go up over time because they become more and more desirable and people get priced out. And so the Amazon funding has actually required that our projects, which are 99-year ground leases, have affordability for the life of the project. So like 99 years. So the life of the lease, there will be an affordable housing requirement for our buildings, which their financing is helping to underwrite. So in that sense, they've been very forward looking to sort of see how do we get in early to neighborhoods before they're very expensive, and sort of guarantee long-term affordability. So that's another tool that Amazon has brought to the table, which has been very innovative.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. Se nos acabó el tiempo, desafortunadamente. Quiero agradecerles mucho a Liz, Ignacio, Ana Claudia.
Unfortunately, time has run out. I would like to thank you and all of you, Ignacio, Ana Claudia. Your participation has been extremely enlightening and has given us great ideas. So Maria Camila, back to you. Thank you very much, Luis. And thanks to our star panelists today, Liz, Ana Claudia, Ignacio, and Simon, for joining us for this interesting discussion. Perhaps in wrapping up, I would just like to ask you once again to share your feedback and tell us, based on what you've heard today, what financing mechanism you think could work well in your cities and what you think you could apply. So if you can share that with us on Mentimeter so as to wrap up and learn a bit more about the ideas that came to mind, or the sorts of ideas that you might find useful for your cities. Mentimeter, please. There we go. That's today's session. So what financing mechanism do you think you could work in your city based on what you've heard today? So you can scan again and vote and tell us what do you think could work in your city based on what you've heard today? Okay, governance all over, at the beginning, at the end, and value capture. I think this conversation has been very interesting to get some new ideas and to understand about mechanisms that you may perhaps apply in the future in your own cities. And finally, I would like to ask you for some feedback on the session. So you can vote and let us know how useful you found the webinar and if you think you can apply this going forward. So let's do that so as to wrap up for today.
Invitarlos a votar. Ahí están las preguntas en portugués, en inglés y en español.
The questions are in Portuguese, English, and Spanish.
Y bueno, tal vez creo que ahí pueden seguir votando y podemos
And
seguir
you can
recibiendo ese feedback de ustedes, pero
carry on voting and send in your feedback. Finally, I'd like to invite you for next week so that we can wrap up a series on transit-oriented development. I think this conversation we've shared has been very enriching to see what the TOD vision for 2030 is for the LAC region. Thank you very much again, Luis, Liz, Simon, Ignacio, and Ana Claudia for joining us today and for making this conversation so interesting. So thank you very much and see you next week.